So let's make a Lambda function. So let's do this dot create notification Lambda function, and then we will get WebStorm to make this method. And then let's start off very much in the same way we did before last time we made a Lambda function. So we're going to make a new Node.js function. We have to attach the construct to something because Node.js function is a construct. And we're going to attach it to the current stack we're in. So we'll use this. We're then going to give it an ID. So we'll call it brush your teeth function. And then we will give it some properties. So just like we did the last time we went through this process, we need to know where to get the index file, or it doesn't have to be an index file, but the entry point to your Lambda function. So let's set the entry property. We're going to use the path module with Node, and then we will say that we're in the current directory, lambdas, brush your teeth, and then you can see that I've got an index.js file set up here ready to go. And then we're going to have the handler defined as well, and we'll use the function handler. You can see that in our folder here, in our index.js, there's a function called handler. And then let's set up a few other settings while we're here. So we're going to have to set the runtime, and you can see again, runtime is some kind of abstraction, or in this case, it's almost like an enum. And we're going to use ARM, and I don't know why my IntelliSense isn't working very well today. Where are we? Oh, sorry. I'm thinking ahead, thinking to the architecture, not the runtime. So we want Node 18 for the runtime. And you guess where I'm going with this. We're going to set the architecture to be ARM64 because it's slightly more cost effective on Lambda. And it doesn't matter for us in this case what we're using for it. We're easy. So we've got those variables set up there. We're also going to have a look at the timeout setting, which if you know from the API, CLI or other tools is just a number, but in this case it's using the abstraction called duration. So let's set this to duration.seconds because it's going to be a pretty quick function. Let's say in a really awful case scenario it'd take 5 seconds, so that's plenty of time for our timeout. What else should we add? I think if you remember back to the architecture diagram, we're going to need some permissions for calling SES. And if I type in policy here and we autocomplete based on that, you see that we've got a argument called initial policy. You might be wondering, well, where's the role getting created? Where's that being made to form this Lambda function or for the use of this Lambda function? And it's all abstracted away in this construct, which is really nice if you know how the construct works and you're used to it, but can be a little bit of head scratching the first few times you're using it. But in this case, we're not actually going to use initial policy. We're going to use a method on the initialize class when we've created it. So let's clear that off. Let's pop this into a variable and let's call this, let's just call it Lambda function, why not? And then we can call Lambda function dot, and you can see we've got a ton of methods here. Things for, say, adding an alias for it, for versioning, adding layers, adding environment variables, all sorts of stuff. But we can click on or select add to role policy. That's taking a class called policy statement, which in this case isn't a construct, it's just an abstraction. And we've got the usual suspects here. So we've got the statement ID, so we can say allow sending email. We've got the effect, which can be effect.allow. We've got some actions, which are going to be SES send email. And then resources. We're not going to limit this down in this case because it's just going to be one domain identity within our account here we're using for testing. So it doesn't really matter that we're allowing sending email with all identities. But obviously in most cases you want specific resources and resources here. You don't want an asterisk. And then that's going to get put into an IAM policy and attached to the role, and that role is going to get used in our Lambda function. Just like we did before, we're going to return the Lambda function here at the end of the class, and then we'll set an appropriate return type on our method. So let's do Node.js function. Lovely. So we've done a bit of an example of two concepts here. So we've got one for our event rule, and again that had some abstractions on there for forming the cron string, and we've got another one for a Node.js function, and that's got abstractions. It's got enums for the runtime, it's got enums for the architecture, it's got an abstraction for the duration, which is our timeout number, and we've got an abstraction for building up IAM policy statements. So all these things can be a bit overwhelming to learn initially. And one thing that's worth doing is having a look at the type or the documentation for the construct you're using. And you can go property by property and say, okay, is this something that we need to use? This is something that we care about, that is important to us, or can we just leave it? Can we skip it out? And I think that's one strategy I use a lot when I'm building up constructs, is just to go through the complete list of properties and choose what I think makes sense. If I'm newer to it, you can also review the documentation. So if we search for the name of the construct, not the name of the props class, then we've got NodejsFunction here. And NodejsFunction has a basic but not potentially very useful example, and various information about all the methods and all the rest of the properties that are on there. So that's really helpful as well. It can take a bit of time to get used to the abstractions. So I would just allow yourself that time when you're getting started with this, and try and save examples of things as you create them so that you can reuse them later. All right, so we've got our Lambda function, we've got the event rule, but currently they don't interact. Currently they're not talking to each other. So let's pop them into variables. So let's have our rule here, and let's have our Lambda function. And then if we go to the rule, we can see that there are some methods on it, one of which is addTarget. So let's go on to addTarget, and let's have a look at what that method wants. So that wants one argument of an iRuleTarget. You might be thinking, well, it's not very helpful, James. Like, what am I supposed to have for this? What is an iRuleTarget? How do I use this? For that, what I tend to do is I use this little target button here in WebStorm to find the relevant place in the node modules where that's defined. And I'll probably pop up a level to the AWS-CDK-lib package. Whoops, didn't mean to click on that. And I'm going to do a find in files here. Let's have a look for iRuleTarget. And then we can see all the use cases of classes that implement it. So we've got an SQS queue, which is not relevant for us, API destination, API gateway, AWS API, batch job, code pipeline job, and so on and so forth. And eventually we get down to Lambda function here, which is then a class. So that's taking in a Lambda function or an I function, and then some properties. And so we can click on the properties then, expand those. And then there's the event inputs that you want to get sent to the Lambda function. And again, this is an abstraction to identify how that event's going to be manipulated. And so if you're not used to the service, sometimes you might have to go and look at the documentation for the service itself, see how it can be used and some examples, and then translate those examples, translate that service knowledge into the CDK abstraction. And it does take time, but just give yourself that time and you will get used to it, and then you will be flying through writing this code when you're more familiar with them. So let's do that. So let's make that target. Let's add it. So let's say a new Lambda function there, and then we want to import that from the right place. And you can see we're getting it from AWS CDK lib AWS events target. And then it takes an argument of an I function, which will be our Lambda function, and then we don't have to provide any props if we don't want to. We're not really interested in that. We're not interested in any customization. So there we have it. We've got an event rule, we've got a Lambda function, and we've got the two being wired together. So let's try a synth. Let's see how far we get. So that's done. Let's pop to our template. I'm just going to clear off the noise we get from npm at the top. And let's minimize the event rule because we've seen that. So we've got a Lambda permission for being called from EventBridge, which is really nice because that's quite fiddly to get set up, but we don't have to make that ourselves. We've got an IAM role, again, something that's a bit fiddly because we've got to set up the role assumption policy, things like the basic execution policy to write to CloudWatch, and that's all handled for us. That's really nice. And then we've got an IAM policy, and that's being attached to our role, and so that's the SES stuff we saw from earlier, where we were doing lambda function.addToRole policy. And then there's Lambda function itself, as you'd expect, and you can see that with the asset system, it's been bundled up and popped into S3. And then we've got a bit of metadata for CDK, which we're not really interested in, and the rest of the usual gubbins, the boilerplate that comes with any CDK template. So just by doing that, just by using these sort of high-level constructs, the level 2 constructs, we've avoided a lot of the boilerplate, a lot of the manual fiddling around, getting the basics set up for our resources here, for our Lambda function and our EventBridge rule. And we could take this one step further, and we could produce a custom L3 construct that actually provides sensible defaults over Lambda functions. You might want to still call it level 2, depending on how much you're adding into it, or maybe it justifies itself as level 3 if there's enough going in there. But you can build your own developer experience. You can build your own abstractions on top of what AWS provides. All right, so that is the rough outline of the CDK code. Join us in the next lesson when we look at how to switch our handler over to TypeScript.